Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 238 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. There are many intriguing figures in early American history, and Benedict Arnold is one of those figures. Arnold was a military hero who greatly furthered the cause of the American Revolutionaries with his bravery on the battlefield. And yet, he was also someone who did something quite unexpected. He betrayed his country. Arnold is someone that you've been asking to know more about since the start of this podcast, and now there are a couple fresh new takes on his life and actions, so I'm pleased to offer you one. Today we're joined by the award-winning historian Stephen Brumwell, who will help us explore the life and deeds of Benedict Arnold, as well as Arnold's stunning journey from hero to traitor. With details from his book Turncoat, Benedict Arnold and the Crisis of American Liberty, Stephen shows us how Benedict Arnold's early life and childhood influenced the trajectory that his adult life would take, details about Arnold's heroics on the battlefield, and what the evidence has to say for why Arnold made the decision to betray the United States and defect to the British. But first, I'll be in Pittsburgh next month, June 13 through 15, for the annual Omohundro Institute Conference, which means I'm planning a meetup on Saturday, June 15 from 2:30 to 4 p.m. Now, I don't have a location for this meetup just yet, so this is really more of a save-the-date announcement. So really, be sure you put Saturday, June 15 from 2:30 to 4 p.m. aside. And if you happen to have ideas about where we could meet up in Pittsburgh, please let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. All right. Are you ready to explore the life of one of the most complicated figures of Revolutionary America? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an award-winning historian. He worked as a newspaper reporter before attending graduate school, where he earned his PhD in history. Today, he works as a freelance writer and as an independent scholar. He's published 6 books, including George Washington, Gentleman Warrior, which won the 2013 George Washington Book Prize, and, most recently, Turncoat, Benedict Arnold and the Crisis of American Liberty. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Stephen Brumwell.
Thanks, Liz. It's a real pleasure to join you.
So, Stephen, why Arnold? As I looked at the scope of your scholarship, I saw 5 books with a really strong interest in 18th century soldiers and officers. But Benedict Arnold wasn't your standard soldier or officer. So I'm wondering if that's the interest that brought you to study Arnold in your 6th book. Could you tell us a bit more about what attracted you to Arnold?
Well, I've always been interested in the sheer drama of Arnold's story, and especially this kind of shocking metamorphosis from hero to traitor. But more specifically, it was issues that I came across when I was writing the book about Washington that prompted me to take a look at Arnold's story in detail. Like Washington, Arnold was kind of obsessed really with this question of his reputation, or what his contemporaries would have referred to as their honor. And yet at the same time, Arnold commits what many, both at his own time and ever since, would consider to be perhaps the most dishonorable act possible, by seeking to betray his comrades and his commander, George Washington. So I wanted to try and find an answer to that kind of central enigma of his life.
Arnold was definitely an intriguing figure with a lot of drama in his life. And if we want to really get into that drama and learn how he turned from hero to traitor, where do you think we should begin his story?
Well, I think Arnold's early life is very significant for the kind of trajectory of his subsequent career. Now, he's a New Englander and born in Norwich in Connecticut in 1741. Arnold was always extremely proud of the fact that his ancestors had been prominent in the early days of the colony of Rhode Island. But his own upbringing was rather more humble. His father, who was one of a whole chain of family members who were called Benedict, was a reasonably successful merchant captain trading with the West Indies. But he became an alcoholic, probably because 4 of his 6 children succumbed pretty swiftly to epidemic illness. So I think perhaps this kind of grief had an effect on driving him to seek solace in a bottle. So with his father increasingly incapable of handling affairs, it was Benedict's mother, Hannah, who took control of things, and she arranged for him to be apprenticed to her cousins, Daniel and Joshua Lathrop, who were successful apothecaries or druggists also in Norwich. Their business really took a boom during the kind of mid to late 1750s when they became main suppliers for the British Army, which at this time was assembling to fight the French in upstate New York and elsewhere during what we know as the French and Indian War. And this raises the whole issue of what part the teenage Benedict Arnold played in that conflict. There's quite a bit of debate about this. Some people suggest that on the basis of muster rolls kept by regiments, and also an advertisement in a newspaper which lists a deserter by the name of Benedict Arnold, he actually served in the provincial forces, which were the troops raised by an individual colony, in this case, New York. I think that's highly unlikely because if Benedict Arnold had been a deserter, I think that this fact would have been picked up when he became notorious for defecting to the British and would certainly have been mentioned by his many critics at that time. And also, I think it's highly unlikely that as someone who was apprenticed, he would just be able to take off a few months every summer to go and serve with the New York provincials, then come back and just carry on where he'd left off. So whilst I don't think he actually served for any lengthy period of time, there's another theory which I think is far more likely, and that's that he turned out with his home militia, the Norwich militia, which called upon the services of everyone aged 16 to 60, and by this stage Benedict was 16, during 1757, when there was something of a crisis, an emergency situation, when the French, under the Marquis de Montcalm, came down from Canada with a large force of regular troops, militia and Native American warriors, and ultimately besieged Fort William Henry at the foot of Lake George. This is the episode which forms the basis for James Fenimore Cooper's novel The Last of the Mohicans and the several film versions that have been made about that. So Benedict Arnold serves out his apprenticeship in about 1762, after the fighting in America has come to an end. The Lathrop brothers, who seem to have been pretty impressed with his performance, gave him a starter fund of £500 so that he could buy stock to set up his own business. Interestingly, this involved a trip to London, at the very heart of the British Empire. So Benedict Arnold spent some time in London in the early 1760s, buying goods to stock his own store. He started out as a shopkeeper based in New Haven, Connecticut, but he swiftly found that life too dull and rapidly started to follow in his father's footsteps by becoming a merchant skipper, ranging far and wide, really, throughout what historians like to see as the British Atlantic world, seeing both metropolitan Britain and the North American colonies as part of this trading network. Arnold sailed to the West Indies and also the Bay of Honduras and to Quebec, and also, as I only recently discovered, to Amsterdam, where I live myself. These were long, hazardous voyages, often in small ships, not great vessels, just brigs, sloops, schooners. Arnold was also known as a horse trader, or a jockey, which was a kind of a interchangeable term at the time, bringing herds of horses overland from Canada. Interestingly, this is a scenario where he's driving these horses across the frozen surfaces of Lake George and Lake Champlain. Quite an interesting picture, which is very different from what you kind of imagine. So Arnold was ambitious as a businessman, not too scrupulous about his dealings. He was also a kind of tough, physically strong, stocky, athletic characters. And during this time, when he was serving as a kind of a merchant captain, he became used to giving orders and to living quite a tough lifestyle. It was during these same years, really from the 1760s through to the early 1770s, that Arnold was among those who started to bridle British legislation that was intended to generate revenue in a way to try and claw back the cost of defeating the French during the previous war, and also to tighten up trade regulations. Despite some ups and downs in his own business, it seems clear that Arnold prospered. For example, he joined the New Haven Masonic Lodge, he married Margaret Mansfield, who was the daughter of the High Sheriff, Samuel Mansfield. And by 1771, he was actually wealthy enough to build a grand mansion in New Haven and to aspire to the lifestyle of a gentleman, which basically meant that you saw yourself as more refined than the usual run of society, and you were able to enjoy the kind of imported luxury goods, the kind of items that Arnold had seen during his stint in London.
To hear you talk about Benedict Arnold's early life, I mean, you really painted a portrait of a man who was trained to make an impact during the Revolution. Of course, no one knew the Revolution was coming, but Arnold clearly had experience overseas in Canada. He sailed to and from the West Indies, acquired supplies, and led and gave orders to men. And this really raises a question. When the Revolution materialized and North Americans began taking sides, why did Arnold choose the side of the Revolutionaries?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, that kind of picture you've painted. Arnold definitely had this kind of can-do attitude, if you want to put it that way. And because of that, he'd done pretty well for himself under the British regime. But at the same time, it's clear that he identified with the growing opposition to imperial tyranny, if we can call it that. For example, when he was far away trading in the West Indies, he received news of the Boston Massacre of 1770, and he reacted very angrily. How could Americans, just sit inactive when the Redcoats were there slaughtering their fellow citizens, committing what he called cruel, wanton, and inhuman murders? So prior to 1775, as we've already seen, Arnold's own military experience was very limited, probably no more than a few weeks in the militia. However, his emergence as a leading figure in New Haven and someone who was associated with the Sons of Liberty and people who are basically now starting to intimidate people who were seen as having pro-British loyalist tendencies, I think this puts Arnold very much in the camp of those who were extremely sympathetic to the cause of liberty. And Arnold later, when he's talking about the reasons that led to his defection to the British, his change of allegiance, he does emphasize the fact that at the outset of hostilities, he was very much committed because he felt that British policies towards the American colonies were unjust and unfair. So Arnold, because of his background as kind of a forceful, experienced individual, I think this helps to lead to a situation where he is actually elected as captain of New Haven's own company of foot guards, of militia. And this is a particularly elegantly uniformed and well-drilled unit. And as soon as Arnold heard of the fighting at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, he was immediately keen to join the military effort against the British. So here's somebody who's not hanging around waiting to see how things go. He's off out of the starting traps as soon as he knows that hostilities have opened. And I think it's also interesting when we think about why is Arnold so keen to take part in the war. I think there might be another factor which is worth considering. In colonial America, military service was a traditional route to acquiring prestige and influence. And I think this is very important to Arnold. By 1775, there were plenty of retired colonels and officers of other rank in America who'd served alongside the British in the provincial forces during the French and Indian War. Most famously, of course, George Washington, who'd served in the Virginia Regiment. So having established himself as a merchant, this was another way in which Arnold could enhance his standing in society. I think it's likely that it also appealed to his adventurous and aggressive temperament.
So speaking of Arnold's military service, one of the first actions that Arnold took part in was the taking of Fort Ticonderoga in May 1775. Howard would like to know more about Arnold's involvement in this action and how well he would have coordinated with Ethan Allen and his Green Mountain Boys of what we now know today as Vermont.
Yeah, that's a very interesting episode. And we've already heard that Arnold had made these trading trips to Canada, both by sea and also over land. And of course, Fort Ticonderoga lies on that route between New York and Canada in the Hudson Lake Champlain corridor, which is this strategic route between north and south. During those trips, Arnold had become aware that the fort at Ticonderoga, which had once been a formidable strongpoint, had now become dilapidated and would be vulnerable to a surprise attack. Crucially, Ticonderoga also held a large number of cannon, which were badly needed by the Patriot forces, which were, of course, woefully equipped compared to the British. So Arnold approached the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, and they commissioned him as a colonel, or in fact, commander-in-chief, as they styled it, of a force which they gave him authority to go and seize the guns. Arnold was so keen to execute this mission that he headed north before he'd even assembled his specified quota of men. So when he arrived within striking distance of his objective, which is basically where Lake George runs into Lake Champlain, he found that a force had already been put together by Ethan Allen of Vermont, including the rowdy frontiersmen, if you like, who are known as the Green Mountain Boys. Arnold, typically for him, immediately insisted that his commission from Massachusetts entitled him to command the entire expedition, even though he hadn't actually recruited any of the men, unlike Allen, who had his own followers there. Ethan Allen, who was this kind of hulking figure compared to the far stockier Arnold, shared Arnold's headstrong, determined character, and he had no intention of handing over operations to him. But a compromise of sorts was reached, and it was agreed that Arnold could join in with the projected surprise attack on Ticonderoga on condition that he didn't try to give orders. So on 10th of May, in what would amount to the first Patriot, or should I say rebel, depending on which side of the fence you're standing, offensive of the war, the fort was taken in a surprise attack, and its captured cannon would eventually enable George Washington to bombard the British army that was now besieged in Boston, eventually forcing them to evacuate to Halifax in Nova Scotia. So Arnold plays a conspicuous role in leading this significant attack. But because of intercolonial jealousy and also the partisan way in which the event was reported in the colonial newspapers, he received little credit for his role. But his subsequent efforts, which included an amphibious raid on the British post of St. John on the Sorrel River, or the Richelieu River, as perhaps it's better known, later that month, in May 1775, didn't go unnoticed, especially by the man who would become the Commander-in-Chief of Congress's Continental Army, General George Washington.
And of course, not long after he helped take Fort Ticonderoga, Arnold was actually in charge of part of a mission to seize Canada. So, would you tell us about Arnold's march through the wilderness and his command?
Yeah, in late 1775, when Congress decided to invade Canada, they sent one army along the traditional warpath via Lake Champlain and the Richelieu River, but another group of about 1,000 men was ordered to march against the city of Quebec through the wilderness of Maine. And this mission was entrusted to Colonel Arnold. It involved covering some 270 miles of very, very tough terrain in the midst of winter. And despite appalling conditions with terrible weather, sickness, desertion, lack of supplies, Arnold basically drove his men on and succeeded reaching the St. Lawrence River and uniting with another Patriot force under the command of General Richard Montgomery. When Quebec itself was attacked on the last night of 1775, Montgomery was killed and Arnold was wounded in his left leg. The attack was a fiasco, repulsed with very heavy casualties, but Arnold's determination in attempting to continue the siege was widely acknowledged, and it gained him promotion to the rank of Brigadier General and the undisguised admiration of Washington. I think it's interesting that even after Arnold's treason, veterans who survived his epic march to Quebec were proud to recall it when they applied to Congress for pensions. And this feat, I'd say, was the foundation of Arnold's reputation as a leading Patriot general. And he soon went on to consolidate it by services that not only impressed his own countrymen, but also the British. And one thing stands out, and that's during the fall of 1776, when the British launched their own invasion from Canada. Arnold was instrumental in delaying it for several crucial weeks as commander of a Patriot flotilla, which was assembled to contest the dominance of Lake Champlain. Now, although Arnold's fleet was ultimately destroyed by the British, The mere fact that the British had to build a fleet of their own so they could take on Arnold's flotilla cost them valuable time. So by the time they finally did advance and reach Ticonderoga, that fort's defences had been upgraded and were too tough to actually take on, which meant that the British retired for that season. If they'd advanced as they were supposed to do, I think the situation for the Patriots would have been pretty grave, because at the same time, the British under William Howe had beaten Washington quite severely in the New York area, pushed him all the way back through New Jersey into Pennsylvania. So if the Northern Army had rolled down as planned, Washington would have been trapped between two British forces with disastrous consequences, I think. So I don't think we would have seen any Trenton, and we wouldn't have seen any Princeton. And these are usually seen as the kind of the miraculous victories which saved the Patriot course when it was at low ebb. So I think we can give Arnold credit for those too.
And that's really the thing about Benedict Arnold, isn't it? Before Arnold Turncoat, before he switched to the British side, he was a legitimate Patriot hero. He was someone that George Washington and other Revolutionary War leaders could look at and know that he was going to help them advance their cause in crucial ways. And we've talked about some of the ways that he did this. We talked about his deeds at Ticonderoga, at Quebec, and about his naval victory on Lake Champlain. So would you cap this off for us and talk about his deeds at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777?
Sure. By the summer of 1777, then, Arnold was already a celebrated Patriot warrior. Through his exploits in repelling a British raid on Connecticut that spring, he'd actually been promoted to Major General, although it's important to point out that he remained junior to 5 other Major Generals who'd been promoted over his head back in February, even though these were people who'd seen far less action than he had. Arnold was known to friends and enemies alike by now for his brave, dynamic leadership. What newspapers of the day in both the American colonies, former colonies, and also back in London would refer to as his intrepidity. Now, these qualities would prove important when the British staged another invasion from Canada, this time under General John Burgoyne. Burgoyne headed down the Hudson Valley towards Albany, but his troops ran up against Patriot Continental forces and also militia commanded by General Horatio Gates. They were dug in behind extensive defences, and Gates, who was a former British officer, was reluctant to pit them in the open against experienced British and German regular troops. Characteristically, Arnold didn't show any such hesitation. During first clash on 19 September 1777, which historians know as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, Arnold exercised his initiative to feed more and more troops into the fight, inflicting heavy casualties on the British. It was Gates's failure to acknowledge this important role of Arnold's division in this battle, which caused an open rift between the two men. Arnold threatened to leave the army in a huff, but was persuaded by his fellow officers who valued his combat leadership to stay on and see things through. In a second battle, known as the Battle of Bemis Heights, or Bemis Heights on 7th October, Arnold's aggressive frontline leadership helped not only to repel Burgoyne's attack, but to ultimately overrun the British defences. At the moment of victory, Arnold was shot in the left leg and pinned down beneath his dead horse. Now, this wound was far more severe than the wound in that same leg that he'd received at Quebec. According to one witness, Major Henry Dearborn, in his agony, Arnold had cried out that he wished the ball had passed through his heart. Now, that injury left him hospitalised for months and with a lasting limp.
So by the end of 1777, we have a severely wounded Benedict Arnold, someone who had turned to military service to distinguish himself, and distinguish himself he really did numerous times through his military prowess and bravery. And yet, he was also someone that really doesn't seem to have received the type of outward respect that he thought he deserved. I mean, you mentioned how Gates took credit for his actions at Freeman's Farm and how Congress had passed him over for promotion, which had the effect of making him junior in command to men with less military experience. Now, historians like to point out that it was the Battle of Saratoga and that severe wound he received there that caused Arnold to defect to the British. But the question is really, why? Why did he defect? And historians, of course, have lots of answers for this. So, Stephen, I wonder if you would take us through the different events and factors and evidence that you see as playing a role in Arnold's defection.
Sure. The wound that Arnold received during the climactic fighting of the Saratoga campaign was very serious. We hear it, his leg was shattered. There was the prospect that he was going to have to undergo amputation. He was laid up in hospital for months. And I think when we consider what that would have meant, I think it's important to bear in mind that, he was in this environment where he was surrounded by the sights, sounds and smells of hundreds of badly wounded men in quite a concentrated space, the hospital at Albany. So I think this would have had a traumatic effect on him. And it would have also provided him with a kind of an interlude where he would have had an opportunity to think over the kind of grievances that were starting to fester with him, festering as much as his physical wounds, if you like. And of course, chief amongst those was this belief that his services, even before Saratoga, hadn't been properly recognized by Congress, that less deserving people had been promoted over his head. Now, as George Washington tried to explain to Arnold, there were certain reasons why Arnold hadn't been promoted back when he thought he should have been. Connecticut, his home state, had already had its quota of major generals. So it was kind of a question also of waiting to see when a vacancy would arise. But I think this whole question, there was something about Arnold's personality that made him feel that his services weren't being properly recognized. And I think it ties in with his obsession, which I think is apparent quite early on, with his reputation and with his standing. We know that he was very concerned about his reputation, his honor, and there's stories that he'd fought a duel in the West Indies during his trading days. And also, shortly after the attack on Ticonderoga, he'd become involved in a fracas with an officer, James Easton, who he felt had disrespected him. And he basically challenged Easton to a duel. When Easton refused to fight like a gentleman, Arnold had roughed him up anyway. So in the aftermath of Saratoga, we've got this situation where Arnold is clearly very disgruntled. And when he finally does get his restoration of rank, when he gets promoted and gets seniority he'd always wanted, it doesn't seem by this stage to really have as much of an impact upon him as you would think it should have. So that kind of suggests that perhaps now he's got other grievances which kind of supersede the original problems he had.
Now, as you looked at all the different evidence that you found and collected, what did you make of Arnold's claims that Congress had overlooked him? Do you think Congress had unfairly passed him over?
I think Congress obviously had a great deal of business to handle. Arnold was one among many officers who had problems. If you look at the mass of correspondence to and forth that Congress had to handle, you can see that really Arnold's problems might have loomed large to him, but they were nowhere near so large to the members of Congress who were dealing with all kinds of business on a daily basis. And you can sense amongst congressmen kind of growing exasperation that they're being bombarded with petitions from officers like Arnold, quibbling over matters of rank, seniority, this kind of thing. And the members of Congress, of course, they're not soldiers, they're politicians. They're increasingly exasperated by what they see as these cantankerous officers who are more concerned about their personal standing and reputation than they are about the glorious cause in which they are engaged. So I think perhaps Congress wasn't going out of its way to victimize Arnold, but that was the way that Arnold saw it. And he starts to talk about the ingratitude of Congress, the fact they're not properly recognizing his services.
And of course, this was a situation where George Washington tried to step in and diffuse it. He really liked Arnold. He wanted this situation to go away. So, Stephen, would you tell us about George Washington's actions to help soothe Arnold and make this situation, the feeling that he's underappreciated, go away?
Washington was a long-standing admirer of Arnold. And here he had this crippled officer who couldn't take part in active campaigning in the field, but Washington wanted to make sure he gave him some kind of honourable employment that would reflect his achievements. So he appointed him as the military commandant of Philadelphia, a role that Arnold picked up in June of 1778. Now, at that time, Philadelphia had just been evacuated by the British after a military occupation lasting almost a year. There were many hardcore loyalists, those who were active supporters of the Crown, who had left with the British. But the city still remained very much a divided city, riven by tensions and suspicions between those who saw themselves as staunch patriots, those who it was felt had been too cozy with the occupying redcoats, and those who really just wanted to keep neutral. And basically, I think it's interesting to spare a thought for those neutral citizens who I think reflect the bulk of the population in the colonies at this time, or certainly perhaps say 2/5 of the population was equal to the number of those who you could describe as committed patriots. Now, it was Arnold's job to try and keep a lid on this very volatile situation and to stop the tensions boiling over into open violence and disorder. So for Arnold, this was pretty much a poisoned chalice. I think there were several reasons for this, one of which was that Arnold, as a military officer, would be rubbing up against civilians. And as Washington himself acknowledged, this was a conflict in which the military had to always show itself to be seen as the servants of civilian government. Otherwise, there was a danger that a permanent or standing army might emulate the Roundhead, the veterans of Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War of the previous century, and end up enforcing what amounted to a military dictatorship. So, as a soldier supervising civilians, Arnold was placed in a very delicate situation. And his job was made even more difficult because of the unusually complicated nature of the political situation in Philadelphia. Not only was it home to Congress, but it was also capital of Pennsylvania, a state which had an unusually radical constitution and whose representatives were just as prickly in temperament as Arnold was himself. So really, although Washington sent Arnold to Philadelphia for the best of reasons, it was probably the worst possible thing he could do in terms of Arnold's future.
So when do you think Benedict Arnold made the decision to commit treason and turncoat? Do you think it was during his command in Philadelphia?
That's a very interesting question, and it's one for which it's difficult to provide a definitive answer, but which it is possible to speculate about based on the evidence. I think that when Arnold first came to Philadelphia, although he did have grievances and he felt that he hadn't really been given the kind of recognition that he deserved by Congress, I don't think at this stage he was thinking about actively defecting. I think it was more the experiences he encountered whilst he was in Philadelphia that start to turn him towards thinking that perhaps he was backing the wrong side and that perhaps it was time to think of a different approach to his own future. And what basically happens, it's a very complex story, but what basically happens whilst Arnold is in Philadelphia is that he quickly runs up against opposition and criticism from the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania, which pretty much embodies the more radical tendencies which are circulating at this time. And they see Arnold as someone who's, perhaps too friendly with people who are suspected of still having loyalist sympathies. He's someone who doesn't really conform to the more austere Republican virtues. For example, he enjoys going to the theatre, which is the kind of thing which was associated with the British during the occupation. He enjoys his high living. He has a carriage to drive him round the streets of Philadelphia, which is something which sticks in the craw of the Republicans. Although when you consider that Arnold was still in pain from his wound, he found it very difficult to walk or ride. I think perhaps that might well explain why he was being driven around. But basically, there's friction between him and the Supreme Executive Council, especially its president, Joseph Reed. And Reed and his council put together a list of charges against Arnold. Everything from profiteering, for which there were certain grounds, to siding with those who were seen as enemies against the cause of liberty, which was more unfounded, and also using state property like state wagons to transport his own material. Now, in the great scheme of things, this was, pretty minor stuff. But these charges are put forward and they eventually form the basis of what will become a military court-martial. So by the spring of 1779, Arnold's getting sick and tired of the kind of criticism he's facing at the hands of Joseph Reed, and also the failure of Congress to fix a date for his court-martial on the charges being brought by Joseph Reed and his colleagues. We know from a letter that Arnold wrote to Washington on the 5th of May, which is almost kind of hysterical in tone, that this was very much on his mind. It's shortly after this, on 10th of May, that we know that Arnold made his first approach to the British in New York through an emissary, the loyalist shopkeeper Joseph Stanbury. But I think it's highly unlikely that this was just an immediate decision. I think that Arnold had been mulling this over for some months, probably since the beginning of 1779, when his problems with Reed and his colleagues were really coming to a head. And I think this kind of compounded his previous grievances with Congress. So I would say that, we can look at early 1779 as the time at which Arnold decides that, the cause for which he had fought and bled getting a bit off course and perhaps to take a different course.
So now we have an approximate when for Arnold's decision to commit treason. Do we know how he decided he would go through with that decision? I mean, how exactly did Arnold go about telling the British, I'm ready to turncoat, I'm ready to switch sides, let's do this?
Yeah, it was widely assumed at the time that Arnold had actually been approached by the British, and that the word they often used, he'd been seduced with offers of gold. Basically, he'd been bought. But it's clear that it was Arnold himself who made the first move. As I mentioned, he used an intermediary, the Philadelphia shopkeeper Joseph Stansbury, and through him approached Sir Henry Clinton, who was the British commander-in-chief now based in New York. And he offered his services in any way that would be acceptable to the British. I think the timing of this is interesting because this is May 1779, and Arnold's actual defection, his physical going over to the British, only occurs in September 1780. So he'd actually offered to actually go over to the British in person at that much earlier date. Now, this initial approach was handled by Clinton's head of intelligence and also close personal friend, Captain John Andre, who's an interesting character in his own right. By then, Andre had already been serving in America for 4 years. He'd been captured in Canada during the fighting in 1775, but after being exchanged, had become aide-de-camp to General Charles Grey, and he saw much action, especially during the campaign that had led to the British occupation of Philadelphia. Whilst there, as part of Sir William Howe's kind of immediate entourage of favoured officers, he'd been busy arranging theatrical performances, other social events. And in the spring of 1778, these had culminated in a great extravaganza known as the Mischianza or Medley, which had been staged to honour Howe's return to Britain. Debonair, handsome, young, popular, Captain Andre had befriended several of the young women of Philadelphia's leading families. And interestingly, these included Peggy Shippen, who Arnold had married in April of 1779, just 1 month before he made his first overtures to Sir Henry Clinton. Now, by way of Stansbury, who was based in Philadelphia, and a clergyman named Jonathan Odell, who was in New York, Captain Andre and Benedict Arnold maintained sporadic correspondence over coming months, maintaining security by using codes that were keyed to certain books which they both had and using assumed names. Now, Arnold used various names, particularly Gustavus and Mr. Moore, while Andre often went under the name of John Anderson.
What about the why? We now have a when he decided to commit treason and a how he decided to go through with it, but why did he decide to do it? And I realize I've asked you the $1,000,000 question here, so why don't you take a moment to think about it, and I'll talk about our episode sponsor. I'm really glad we have this opportunity to talk to Stephen about Benedict Arnold. I mean, aside from your requests about what everyday life was like in early America, episodes about Benedict Arnold have been your number 2 request. And thank you so much for your topic requests, by the way. I really appreciate them, and they've really come to drive this podcast. Did you know that most episodes come from your requests? The requests you send me are just part of the way that you support the Ben Franklin's World community. You also help by spreading the word about the podcast, by telling your friends and family about it, by providing me with feedback so I can improve the show, and you interact with me and the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team on Facebook and Twitter. And in those interactions, you've asked us for a place where you can buy items like t-shirts with the Ben Franklin's World name and logo on it. And I'm pleased to tell you that the Omohundro Institute and I have created such a store at benfranklinsworld.com/shop. When you visit benfranklinsworld.com/shop, you'll find a couple of great t-shirt, hoodie, and tote bag designs. And each item you purchase will help raise some funds to help the Omohundro Institute and I keep this podcast going. This store is still new, and we love your feedback on it. So if you don't see an item that you'd like to see, or if you have ideas about designs we could use, please send them to us. Just email me, liz@benfranklinsworld.com, and the Omohundro Institute and I will see what we can do to stock the items that you want to display your Ben Franklin's World pride. So visit our new shop and order your new Ben Franklin's World t-shirt, tote bag, or hoodie today. benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Okay, Stephen, our moment's passed, so now we need to know, why do you think Arnold decided to commit treason? In all the historical sources that you looked at, all the bits of evidence you went through, did you ever find that Arnold stated his reasons for switching sides?
Yeah, I think this is the whole central question of Arnold's story. Why did he betray the United States? And of course, there are various theories which have been knocking around ever since his treason first came to light. And at that time, when it was revealed that he was to receive a lump cash sum for delivering up West Point, it was assumed that his defection was all about the money. In essence, he needed British gold to pay off his debts and to fund his lavish lifestyle. Yet in fact, when Arnold first approached the British, the issue of money only came up in connection with the question of compensation for any property that he would lose in consequence of his decision. Arnold's more thoughtful contemporaries, who included men like Alexander Hamilton, also speculated that he'd become embittered at his treatment by politicians who not only failed to recognize his services, but who had hounded him on a range of charges, many of them quite frivolous. That this assumption that Arnold was motivated by a combination of greed and resentment is probably still the most common explanation for his treason. But the closer I looked at the evidence, the more I was convinced that Arnold acted primarily from far deeper ideological reasons. From the very opening of his negotiations with the British until the very end of his life, Arnold consistently maintained that he was acting in what he believed to be the best interests of his countrymen. And by delivering some kind of a knockout blow to the Continental Army, he would save them from a corrupt and increasingly dysfunctional Congress. And at the same time, he would end the bloodshed of what seemed to him to be a stalemated and increasingly futile civil war within the British Empire. And Sir Henry Clinton reminded Arnold soon after he made his first approach, just a month after, that when he'd offered his services, he'd done so for the delivery of his country. I think that's very significant. Sir Henry also recalled that from the very beginning, Arnold had expressed an intense dislike of the French alliance that had come about in the wake of Saratoga, ironically, something that he was very much a part in actually implementing. And this was a pact which also went against the gut instincts of many Americans, for whom the French were the traditional enemy, most recently, of course, during the French and Indian War. Intriguingly, amongst the most significant sources I found were letters from the 1790s, and these are amongst the papers of the British Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, and they're held in the British National Archives in London. And they show that Arnold was still maintaining this ideological justification for his actions, long after anyone might be expected to feel that they no longer mattered, that no one even cared about the American war. So in 1792, 12 years after his defection, he's maintaining to Pitt that he changed his allegiance in the best interest of his countrymen to avoid an effusion of blood. And in that same year, he actually fought a duel with an English lord who'd cast aspersions on his reasons for changing sides. So you've got someone who's prepared to pick up a dueling pistol or a sword and actually go out and fight against what he considers to be someone who's besmirching his good character. So without doubt, Arnold was driven by an unswerving self-belief. A phrase that occurs again and again in his correspondence is conscious of the rectitude of my intentions. Whatever anyone else might have thought, Arnold himself was convinced that he was acting for the right reasons and for honourable reasons, and this was a stance he was prepared to defend on the dueling field. Of course, Arnold ultimately backed the wrong side, and history tends to be written by the winners. So his claims have typically been dismissed as nothing more than the excuses of a notorious traitor. But I'd suggest that based on the evidence I've come across, evidence that has been around for many years and evidence which is only now coming to light, Arnold really did believe himself that he was acting for the best of reasons. But of course, by ending the American War and repairing what Arnold saw to be a rift within the British Empire, he would hope to gain certain rewards, not least the eternal gratitude of King George III, for whom the estranged American colonies were a major concern. And like General George Monk, who'd aided the restoration of King Charles II back in 1660, he could expect to receive recognition both in terms of material wealth and in terms of prestige, exactly the kind of things that he felt he'd been denied by the ungrateful Congress. And another factor, I think, behind Arnold's decision to defect is the role of his young wife, Peggy Shippen. As they were married in April 1779, and Arnold's first approach to the British was just a month later, it's tempting to make some kind of a link and to speculate that Peggy, who, as we've seen, had spent time with Redcoat officers like Andre during the British occupation of Philadelphia, it's tempting to argue that somehow she'd turned her impressionable husband, that she'd been some kind of Lady Macbeth figure. But while I'm convinced that Peggy Arnold was aware of the unfolding treason and actually would go on to play an active part in moving it forward, I don't think there's any evidence that she actually instigated the conspiracy and that it was actually her idea.
Now, as he made his final plans to defect, Benedict Arnold wrote to the British and agreed that he would prove his loyalty to the Empire by delivering the American post at West Point, which both Arnold and Henry Clinton agreed would help the British deliver a final blow to the Continental Army. Stephen, Fred wonders about West Point. So would you tell us about West Point, Arnold's plans to hand it over to the British, and what handing over West Point to the British would have meant for the American war effort if Arnold had been successful?
Well, Arnold's conspiracy, his plan to end the war by dealing this kind of knockout blow, increasingly focused on West Point, the fortress complex that had been developed from 1778 onwards to basically block the River Hudson and thereby deny the British access to this easier route of communication between New York and Canada. And if the British had gained control of the Hudson, it also would have meant they would effectively have divided the rebel states, cutting off New England from those on the other side of the river, what were known as the Middle and the Southern colonies. So West Point, by this stage then, by 1780, is defended by a complex of forts and gun batteries, and the river itself is physically blocked by a massive chain from bank to bank. So securing West Point has been a major British objective for some time, not least because not only would it split the rebel colonies, but also by gaining control of the crossing of the river at King's Ferry, just a few miles downstream, it would disrupt what was a key supply line for the Continental Army. And if you can do that, you either force Washington to disband his troops because they're starving, or you force him to risk an open battle with the British to try and free up his communications. So this objective of West Point was all very well, but how would Arnold actually go about delivering West Point up to the British? After all, it's garrisoned by several thousand men, and it's not that easy just to give up a major strong point. So by the late summer of 1780, the British, under Sir Henry Clinton in New York, had put together a basic plan, which was that they would wait for Washington to attempt to besiege New York, which we know was something that Washington wanted to do, in conjunction with French forces which had arrived at Rhode Island during the summer. When that happened, Arnold was to give up West Point, which would presumably mean giving up to some kind of a surprise British attack. And that would leave Washington too far away to help immediately, but Washington might be expected to go to the assistance of West Point. That would leave his French allies in the lurch, and they would then be eliminated by the British. But that plan changed in September the 14th, when the British fleet under Admiral Rodney arrived, which meant that the Royal Navy had supremacy in American waters and didn't need to bother about the French. And it was decided to launch an attack directly against West Point. Now, Sir Henry Clinton had the perfect screen for this because he'd already assembled a task force of about 3,000 men, which was intended to go down to the Chesapeake region. And these men were already assembled at New York. They were already aboard the transport ships. They were ready to go. And the object, or the plan, was that once the go-ahead was given, these troops would be taken up the Hudson on a single tide. And we know that the Hudson River has a very powerful flood tide. So this wasn't something that was unfeasible. In fact, Sir Henry Clinton had done something very similar in October 1777 when he'd taken an army up the Hudson and captured Fort Clinton and Fort Montgomery, which were downstream from West Point. So this is something which the British were actually capable of doing. Now, the finer points, though, of how and when the fort's complex at West Point would be delivered up was something that still needed to be decided in a face-to-face meeting with Benedict Arnold. And I think it's important to emphasize that the British at this stage weren't simply counting on capturing West Point. They were also hoping to capture George Washington and his entourage, his so-called family, his military family who traveled around with him. And that would include the Marquis de Lafayette, General Henry Knox, Alexander Hamilton, and other leading officers. We know that Arnold was also hoping to bag the French envoy to the United States, the Chevalier La Luzon. And when he passed through West Point on the 24th September on his way to meet the French in Rhode Island, we know that from La Luzerne that Arnold tried to get him to stay there for 4 or 5 days. So he hoped to bag Washington and other major figures. Now, if we think about the likely consequences, West Point itself was an extremely important strategic objective, which Washington was prepared to defend at all costs. The loss of West Point would have been a very significant blow to the Patriot cause. If we combine that with the loss of Washington, or even take the loss of Washington on his own, I think you have an extremely significant situation. I think you have a situation where Congress would have been forced to come to some kind of terms with the British and to reach some kind of a negotiated peace settlement.
That was certainly a thick plot. But of course, we know that Washington was at Yorktown in 1781 and wasn't captured at West Point in 1780. So how did Arnold's plan fall apart?
Yeah, what would prove to be the fatal flaw in the plan was this need to set up a face-to-face meeting with Arnold just to establish beyond the slightest doubt that this wasn't some kind of double bluff and that Arnold, the former Patriot hero, really was what he seemed to be. And also, as I mentioned, just to kind of finalize the details of how this would actually take place, how the surrender or how the occupation of West Point would actually be organized. So there have been several attempts to arrange a meeting between Major Andre, who'd been handling much of the correspondence with Arnold. And of course, it's Major Andre now, not Captain. He's been promoted. And one attempt made on the 11th of September at Dobbs Ferry, further downriver from King's Ferry. And Arnold had actually gone out on the river to try and meet Andre, but the British guard boats in the area hadn't been warned that this meeting was going to take place. So they opened fire on Arnold's barge, and he was almost killed and forced to go back on shore. And Arnold himself, looking back, identified this as a key factor in the ultimate failure of the conspiracy. Andre did come upriver on the 20th of September in the Vulture sloop, and he had a meeting with Arnold in the early hours of 22nd of September. We don't know exactly what happened, but it seems they were speaking for several hours, and this is when they would have finalized the details of what was actually going to happen in terms of the capture of West Point. Andre was intending to return to New York with this information, with this crucial confirmation, in the same way he'd come, by water via the Vulture sloop. But later that same morning, purely on his own initiative, a Patriot colonel, James Livingston, decided to bombard the Vulture, force her to slip her moorings and move further downriver. So this meant that Andre was obliged to try and get back to New York by land instead of by river. And this meant he had to cross the river at King's Ferry and then to go to New York through what was known as the neutral ground. This was basically Westchester County, and this was an area which had been ravaged by both armies, was a bit of a no man's land, if you like, which was prowled by groups of freebooters. And Major Andre was pretty much home and dry when he was run into a patrol of militia. Well, they're called militia, but they could have been freelance guys who were out for their own interests near Tarrytown. Here, he seems to have had a kind of a loss of his usual control. He'd actually been given a pass by Arnold, which, if he'd shown, probably would have got him through without any problems. But instead, the men who'd stopped him, who'd been attracted by the fact that he looked like a gentleman, he was riding a good horse, he was wearing good clothes, and he had these fancy white-top boots, they decided to search him. I think they were basically just looking for whatever they could find, looking for money, looking for other goods. But when they stripped Andre down to his stockings, they found documents concealed inside his stockings. And these were taken to Colonel Jameson, the local commander. And these were documents written in Benedict Arnold's own hand, giving detailed descriptions of the defences of West Point and other matters. Incredibly, despite all the evidence, while Jameson sent the package of incriminating letters to Washington, he also sent another courier to Arnold, informing him that Andre, who was under his assumed name of John Anderson, had been arrested. By a stroke of luck, Arnold was the first to receive news of developments. And as he was at breakfast on the morning of 25th of September, he received this note from Jameson's courier. At that exact time, he was expecting Washington at any hour. But knowing his plan had been foiled, he coolly excused himself from his guests, went down to the river and got his bargeman to row him to the Vulture. When Washington arrived, not long after, he was told that Arnold was over at West Point, and that's where he went. When Washington and his entourage came back from West Point without having found Arnold, it was discovered that Peggy Arnold was stricken by what seemed to be a bout of hysteria. And it was only now that the other messenger arrived with the incriminating documents, and all finally became clear. And Washington is said to have declared, "Who can we trust now?" And that was his shocked response. This was the first that Washington knew that Arnold had turned traitor.
So what happened to Arnold after these plans went awry? Stephanie would like to know more about what happened to Arnold after West Point.
Arnold, when he initially escapes, he goes to New York, and in the aftermath, you have this great explosion of anger against the traitor. His effigy is burned in Philadelphia and in many other places. So he becomes like the kind of real hate figure for the Patriot cause. But Arnold himself, he's now a brigadier general in British service. So wearing the red coat of King George, he goes on active campaign against his former comrades. And he leads an expedition to Virginia where he inflicts a lot of damage on the Patriot cause or the rebel cause. And Washington sends Lafayette down to try and deal with him. And he makes it clear to Lafayette that if he collars Arnold, Arnold is to suffer summary justice. He's to be hanged. And we know that Washington mentions that he longs to see Arnold in gibbets, which basically means that after he's been executed, Arnold's body will be encased in gibbet irons or chains and left to rot on the gallows as a kind of a dreadful warning to other traitors. But Arnold isn't captured, and he continues serving the British and is later involved in a raid on New London in his home state of Connecticut, which only leads him to become more of a hate figure for the Patriots. Now, Arnold in 1782 ends up in London, where he receives kind of a mixed reception, really. In London, there'd been a lot of interest in the fate of Major Andre. Whilst Arnold had escaped to New York, Andre had remained in the custody of the Patriots, and although they'd offered to exchange him for Arnold, Sir Henry Clinton did not feel he could return someone who'd come over to the royal cause, and Major Andre was hanged. So Andre's fate had received a lot of coverage in the press in Britain, and there was a great deal of sympathy for him. So there was a certain kind of animosity towards Arnold because of Andre. But it's significant that King George III was very receptive to Arnold, and he was received at court along with Peggy Arnold. And the reception was very warm, so warm that Benjamin Franklin in Paris was kind of rather sickened that they should receive such attention. And Arnold had hoped that he would be sent back to America and the rank of Major General and be in charge of basically an initiative to carry on the war. But he was overtaken by events, and by this stage, following the British defeat at Yorktown in 1781, interest in prosecuting the war by Lord North's administration in London had rapidly declined. So the interest now was just in negotiating a peace settlement. So Arnold never was sent back to try and prosecute the war. And in London, he was amongst the many people who tried to obtain some kind of compensation from the British government for the losses they'd incurred by committed to the Crown cause. And although he'd put together a formal claim and waited for a year or so to see whether he would actually get what he considered to be a reimbursement of the money he'd lost, he decided to surrender that claim, to withdraw that claim, and instead he spent some years pursuing various business ventures, most conspicuously amongst the loyalist communities of New Brunswick. But he was never very successful. Arnold's real interest, and I think this is interesting and goes back to his primary motivation, was to try and obtain more military service for the British. And in both 1784 and in 1792, he made requests to try and get an appointment amongst the British forces serving in India with the East India Company. And of course, as Britain had lost her prized American colonies, the British Empire in India had become increasingly popular. And as Arnold was an expert horseman, he saw himself as someone who was perfectly qualified to raise British cavalry to take on the irregular horsemen who were such a feature of the Maharatha armies that the British were up against in India. And he also requested to be appointed as the governor of Dominica in the West Indies, an area with which he was very familiar. But he was always turned down. And part of the reason seems to have been, it was never really articulated, but it seems to have been this notion that someone who had betrayed one cause couldn't be trusted 100% to serve another. But Arnold actually did see military service in the West Indies in 1794, where he was on a trading mission, but he ended up becoming wrapped up in the escalating hostilities between the French Republicans, who now, of course, were a revolutionary regime of their own, and the British. He was actually captured by the French and was due to go to the guillotine, but he escaped. And at the end of June, he joined the British troops who were assembled to attack Guadeloupe. Interestingly enough, these were under the command of General Grey, whom Major Andre, then Captain Andre, had once served as aide-de-camp. And we know that Arnold was actually involved in covering the retreat of the British troops after the attack failed, for which he was given official thanks by the West India planters. And he also received quite a hefty grant of Crown land in Upper Canada. But these were just like kind of glimmers of his former glory. And I think it's fair to say that when Arnold died in London in 1801, aged just 60, he was pretty much a kind of broken man.
Now we should jump into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. And in this time warp, we're going to lend you our time machine because Jacob would like to know, if you could travel back in time and ask Benedict Arnold one question, what question would you ask him and why would you ask it?
Okay, well, given anything like a coherent memoir of Arnold's life, I could think of several questions, but if forced to choose, I think I'd ask him whether, looking back over everything, he still wished that that musket ball that smashed his leg at Saratoga had instead passed through his heart. Despite all of his statements that he acted in the best interest of his countrymen, would he have preferred to have been remembered by them as a hero, as he would have been, or as a traitor?
So, Stephen, who or what comes after Benedict Arnold? Do you have a new research subject yet?
Well, I've always been interested in history kind of far more generally than just the era I've tended to concentrate on. And I've always been interested in historical fiction. So I think that's something I'd like to try my hand at. It's something I've wanted to do since I was a teenager. So I think if I'm ever going to achieve that ambition, it's something I need to try and get on with before too long.
And what if we have more questions about Benedict Arnold? Is there a good place to send them to you?
Sure. The easiest way to reach me or to find out about what I write about is to take a look at my website, which is just brumwellhistory.com. Or if you just Google my name, Stephen Brumwell, that should flag it up pretty swiftly.
Stephen Brumwell, as you know, Benedict Arnold is a really complicated figure, so thank you for helping us better understand him.
Well, thanks, Liz. It's been a real pleasure.
You have to admit, there is a lot of drama in the story of Benedict Arnold. He was a man who just seemed built for adventure. Whether working on the high seas as a merchant skipper, as a horse trader driving herds of horses across Canada, or as a military officer known for fighting in the thick of a fight with his men. He was also a man who thought of himself as a revolutionary. He chafed at British attempts to regulate trade, bristled at the idea that British soldiers would just open fire on American civilians during the Boston Massacre, and he was among the first to volunteer for military service in April 1775. And yet, as steadfast as he seemed to be to the Revolutionaries' cause, Arnold had second thoughts. By 1779, Arnold decided that perhaps fighting for independence wasn't the right course after all. So why did Benedict Arnold defect to the British? This is what Americans have wanted to know from 1780 to our own present day. But as Stephen revealed, we don't and can't know exactly why Benedict Arnold betrayed the United States. Everything up to 1777 suggested that Arnold was a steadfast revolutionary, ready to die for the cause of American independence. But something happened to him between late 1777 and the end of 1779 that caused him to experience a change of heart. Some scholars have said Arnold betrayed his country for money. And we can see how this might be plausible given what Stephen described as Arnold's preference for high living. But the evidence that Stephen found shows that it was Arnold, not the British, who first broached the subject of defection. And that the one and only time Arnold ever seems to have raised a question about money was in an exchange about how he'd be compensated for the property and station he'd lose by supporting the British Empire. Now, this was not an unusual question for Arnold to ask. In fact, it was a proper question. Many loyalists asked this question, and we can see them posing it in the roles of the Loyalist Claims Commission. Now, other scholars have portrayed Arnold's defection as being rooted in his disdain and frustration with Congress. It was no secret that Arnold felt Congress had promoted less worthy men over him. But when Stephen stood back and he looked at all the evidence he found, he came to the conclusion that Arnold's decision to defect was really rooted in deep ideological reasons. In fact, this is what Arnold himself maintained. He felt that he was always acting in the best interests of his countrymen. Now, did Arnold expect the British Crown would reward him for playing what he thought would be a sizable role in ending its long, bloody civil war with North America? Sure. But that's not what Arnold claimed drove him. Now, all of these ideas, of course, color what we think about Benedict Arnold. So I guess the most important lesson we can draw from this exploration is that, like all people, Benedict Arnold was complicated. He wasn't just made up of one attribute like heroism or villainy. He was made up of many attributes that led him to think and act in a variety of ways for a variety of reasons. Now, knowing this doesn't excuse his defection or mean we have to like it, but it does demonstrate why we need to be careful in how we view and interpret the past. As the study of humans and their societies, and how humans and societies have changed over time, history tells us who we are and how we came to be who we are. But history can be complicated precisely because it's created by people. It's a study that can be prone to the human desire to see all the good or all the bad in someone or something. But the best histories are nuanced and critical in how they interpret and portray the evidence we have. In doing so, they really convey an understanding that people are complicated, events and actions are contingent upon their context, and that very little, past or present, is ever black or white. And I think that's what makes history so fun and so interesting to think about. You'll find more information about Stephen, his book Turncoat, plus notes for what we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/238. Don't forget that you can now display your Ben Franklin's World pride because we have t-shirts, tote bags, and hoodies. Take a look at our first designs by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team: Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, Benedict Arnold was an intriguing figure, but he's not the only intriguing figure from our early American past, so I'd love to know who else you find to be fascinating. Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.